He's got one of the most famous names in history, of course, hasn't he? Yes, we're talking, of course, Bond, James Bond. And a film about real men who share their name with the world's most famous spy gets its premiere tonight. Documentary includes a diverse mix of real-life James Bonds, including a Swedish 007 superfan, a gay New York theatre director, and a prison inmate. One of the James Bonds featured is a retired preacher from Texas. He's born in 1952, the year that Ian Fleming began to write the first Bond book. He says having such a notable name has its advantages and its disadvantages.
Indeed it has. It's been both a blessing and a curse. Mainly it's when you meet somebody for the first time and you soon realize they're not interested in you. They're interested in James Bond from the movies.
The Other Fellow is being shown in London and comes to the showroom here in Sheffield a week on Friday. 26th of May, put it in your diary. Writer and director Matthew Bauer told me why he wanted to make the film.
Well, it was mainly the characters I met. I mean, I started by writing to some guys called James Bond on social media. Just saying, I've been thinking this could make a good film, you know, what kind of stories or experience you have to tell. And whilst I was expecting Aston Martin jokes and shaken not stirred jokes, and of course I heard those things, the stories they came back with were much more really like stuff out of the movies, you know, about being, you know, on the run from the police or, you know, sometimes even being on the run from stalkers, and the things that can the weird things that can occur when you have this name.
These real James Bonds, they must be so different really when you met them, but there must be things they have in common, surely.
The most surprising thing that I found they had in common was when your name is James Bond, you always carry ID with you at all times. And, you know, of course, I'm like, why is that? The answer is that, you know, every few years we have an encounter with the police, whether we're pulled over in our car or sort of something like that, whether we're guilty or not. And of course, the first thing they do is ask you for ID. Now, if you don't have ID, the next thing they'll say is, can you then give me your name, please? If you respond James Bond, you will end up being arrested. And one of our characters actually ended up being put in prison for 60 days from an incident that happened when this happened. Because the police said, even though it was confirmed his name was James Bond, they said he was still antagonizing the police officer during the altercation. So yes, if your name is James Bond, and I imagine probably for some other people with famous names, you have to have ID on you always.
It's incredible, isn't it? Do most of them enjoy being called James Bond, or do they get sick of the constant 007 references then?
You know, all of them use the same term, and that is that it's a blessing and a curse. It's kind of a term that goes through the kind of real James Bond community. And I think for all of them, it's not entirely one or the other, is it? You know, I think as with anything in life, it has its yin and yang, its ups and downs. I found it's more about their attitude towards that. And I think for any of us, you know, whether we've got some small problem or large problem or some kind of handicap or whatever, it kind of is in the end about your attitude towards it, you know. And there's some of my characters who've decided to sort of embrace it and, you know, go with the ups and downs and the rough and the smooth and that kind of thing. And then there are others who have fought against it and decided that it's ruined their lives. And I think that's the kind of key differentiator, yeah.
Do any of them actually identify with Ian Fleming's character then?
So tonight's our UK premiere where the Swedish James Bond is attending. Now, the Swedish James Bond is actually a man who was not born as James Bond. But he has spent his entire life turning himself into James Bond. And in 2007, EG 2007, he finally actually changed his name to James Bond as well. And that is because he is Sweden's #1 James Bond fan. But, you know, such a James Bond fan that he's actually spent his entire life turning himself into the character. So, yes, he definitely identifies with the character. And when you meet him, he'll come up and say, hello, my name is Bond, James Bond. And in many ways, he does believe he is Bond, James Bond.
Incredible. So, where's your fascination come from then in James Bond?
I've been a Bond fan ever since I was a kid. And it's funny when making this film. What I realized is that the first time I saw a Bond film, I was about 10 years old. But I wasn't like, oh, this is all new to me. When I finally saw the film, I was like, oh, that's what James Bond is. That's who James Bond is. And it's because even at that age in Australia, I had just heard the name James Bond so much in just the kind of media ether, if you will. And I think that very much comes through in this film. I mean, my characters, they're not really haunted by the plot of the James Bond films. These guys don't really watch Goldfinger and Skyfall. What they're haunted by is the fact that the term James Bond goes over the airwaves in the international media constantly. I mean, we're talking about James Bond right now, especially here in the UK, whether it's, if you pick up any UK newspaper today, I bet the word James Bond is in there somewhere.
So you've got your premiere today of The Other Fellow. It's on at the showroom in Sheffield from a week on Friday. Why should people go and see it? It's time now to sell it then, Matt.
Well, I mean, what may sound like a gimmicky concept somewhat gives way after the first 10 minutes. And then I think you are given a thrill ride, somewhat akin to another Bond film. This is a funny film. Like any kind of great thriller, I can't really tell you how it ends, but I would suggest going in to find out because there are some real surprises in this film.
It's intriguing, isn't it? Absolutely incredible. Matthew Bauer there, the writer and director of The Other Fellow.